Well, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. We're really excited to kick off our next MBA Academy Understanding the Business of Climate session today. And I'm going to start with a really brief introduction about ClimateCAP because I know we've got a lot of new students on campus and a lot of new faces within the ClimateCAP community. So I wanted to start by introducing myself. My name is Jessica Wingert, and I am the program lead for ClimateCAP based here out of Duke's Fuqua School of Business. And if you aren't familiar with ClimateCAP, we were founded with the mission to prepare tomorrow's business leaders, which are many of you that are here on the call today, to understand and respond to the climate challenge by mainstreaming the climate conversation in business schools. ClimateCAP was founded and continues to be led by us here at Fuqua, but we are a global partnership of 40 business schools, and we work really closely with the staff and faculty at those schools on a number of different initiatives, including the summit, the MBA fellowship, our MBA Academy series, which you're here for today, as well as working really closely together on a lot of kind of educator level initiatives. If you haven't yet signed up for our mailing list, please make sure that you do so you can stay up to date on all of these different events. I briefly mentioned our 40 partner schools, so I just wanted to highlight a few of the schools who are supporting ClimateCAP at both the leading and supporting partner level. Wanted to take a second to just briefly thank them for making this program and a lot of our other initiatives possible. And you can see the full list of our entire partner school network on our website. And hopefully by now you've heard of our ClimateCAP MBA Summit, but this is really our flagship event every year, bringing together hundreds of MBA students from around the country to learn about climate and business. And our next summit is being hosted by the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan, February 9th and 10th of next year. But I wanted to highlight this right now because tickets go on sale October 26th. This is a very highly anticipated and highly attended event. So I wanted to let you know because the event definitely will sell out early. So be sure to purchase your tickets promptly if you're interested in attending. And the best way to make sure that you have the information about registration would be to make sure you're signed up for our mailing list. And you can also follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn. I'll put those links up at the end of this, but that's where you can make sure you're getting the most up-to-date information about ticket purchases. One other program I wanted to highlight that we are currently in the process of running is our ClimateCAP MBA Fellowship. And this is really for those students who want to go deep on climate and business. We have 12 fellows who are looking to become the next generation of climate leaders and change makers. Different parts of the fellowship include our learning and development sessions. We've got networking and self-directed project work where the students all work on their own climate action projects throughout the course of the year. Throughout the fellowship, students also receive mentorship and attend cohort building activities virtually. And they also get to attend the summit in person to have their first kickoff event and get to know each other. The smiling faces you see on the screen are our 2023 cohort who are just about to wrap up their session. But we are accepting applications now through November 1st for the 2024 cohort. And you can find program and application information for that on our website. The last thing to highlight, and the reason you're here today, is to mention our MBA Academy virtual learning series more broadly. We're really excited to bring these thought leaders directly to you throughout the academic year. So please be sure to check out our website, climatecap.org, to register for future events as well. And with that, I'm going to stop talking about ClimateCAP and start talking about our awesome speaker for the day. We're really excited to introduce Alicia Seiger. Alicia is a lecturer at Stanford Law School and leads sustainability and energy finance initiatives at Stanford Law, the Graduate School of Business, and the Doerr School of Sustainability. Alicia has served as an advisor to the governors of California and New York, the New York State Comptroller, and numerous pension fund, endowment, and family office CIOs on the topics of climate risk, opportunity, and resiliency. A student of sustainability since the early 1990s, Alicia has designed and executed climate and energy strategies for businesses, foundations, investors, and NGOs for over 2 decades. She has led on the management teams of multiple startups, including at TerraPass, a pioneer of the US voluntary carbon offset market, and Flycast Communications, one of the world's first web advertising networks. She serves on the boards of Ceres and Prime, Coalition, the G7 Impact Task Force Advisory Panel, PG&E's Sustainability Advisory Council, and co-founded the Stanford Professionals in Energy. Her first book, Settling Climate Accounts, Navigating the Road to Net Zero, considers the rise of carbon accounting in the context of the last 3 decades of global climate action, examines the rough edges of net zero in practice, and makes recommendations for the road ahead. Alicia received her BA from Duke University and is a self-designed curriculum focused on environmental science and policy and cultural anthropology. She also earned her MBA at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alicia.
Thank you, Jessica, for that really nice introduction. Sorry if I put you all to sleep with my long bio. Let me first get this screen share. Is that working? Are we where we were? Is
Looks
it
great.
Good enough? Okay,
Yes.
Forgive the toolbars, everyone. This is just sort of the PDF Zoom interface challenge. Before I get started, I just want to recognize that this has been a really hard week for many people. And I just want to say I hope you're taking care of yourselves and taking care of one another, and finding comfort in our shared humanity. So I wanted to start there, but I'm really excited to share this work with you. And it's a lot. It's especially a lot if you're newer to this space. So bear with me. We will have time for questions. I'm going to take us on a journey of climate past, present, and future as we navigate the road to net zero. And I'm going to introduce some big ideas to you, idea around carbon accounting, an idea around what we call emissions liability management, and we'll get to that. So as I said, we'll journey through how we got here. I think understanding the history and the context of this moment is really important to be able to effectively navigate the road ahead. We're going to look around at where we are, what are the tools we're using today, and then we're going to look ahead to these new ideas around carbon accounting and emissions liability management. So how did we get here? As Jessica mentioned in the introduction, my colleagues and I wrote a book that we published in the fall of 2021 that I think, like a fine wine, has just gotten better with age because it really puts the climate action story in context. We were observing the rise of net zero as the dominant organizing principle of climate action, anticipating the Glasgow COP and the the drive of private institutions in steering the climate action story, and wondering, how did we get here? And so this book considers accounting in the triple sense of the word. So it is both a narrative of the climate action story. It is considering accounting in the technical sense, in trying to investigate the ways in which net zero may or may not add up. And then account is the root of accountability. Who's ultimately accountable, and how are we going to make sure that we get to net zero? And so in this narrative consideration, we describe the history of climate action for the last 30 years, starting with the Rio Earth Summit, and identify what we call a series of turns. They're concurrent and imagined in our storytelling, but they, I think, help contextualize this moment of net zero's ascendancy. So briefly, I'll just describe this story, which is to say that the original plan for climate action was to put price it, was to put a global carbon tax and price the externality, and the rest falls into place. That was kind of the superhighway that was envisioned back in Rio in '92 of how we were going to pursue climate action. As you all know, that of course did not happen, and through a lot of difficult conference of the parties over the years, and especially most spectacularly in 2009 in Copenhagen, this kind of global top-down multilateral negotiations started to fall apart. And so drivers of climate action started to steer in the direction of these 3 turns to get climate action back on course. And you started to see these turns emerge even just before Paris, but Paris really marked the beginning of this new era of a come one, come all kind of potluck of climate action, where the leaders were less environment ministers, as had been the case for the previous negotiations, and more of the spotlight on investors and companies and NGOs. And so the first turn was this turn to green finance, which was the idea that we could make the clean technologies cheaper than polluting technologies, and we would be able to kind of buy our way out of the climate crisis on a sort of autopilot of falling costs. And you could argue this turn actually kind of drove us all the way there in the direction of it for the electric power sector, where we have now arrived at a place where the cleaner technologies in driving electricity are actually cheaper than their fossil fuel incumbents. But the realization was that the turn to green finance wasn't going to carry us far enough as you start to consider other sectors that are harder to decarbonize, that have higher, as Bill Gates would say, green premiums. And we needed to decarbonize all sectors at speed and scale, and that this green finance theory was not going to carry us far enough. And so drivers of climate action turned to risk, which in a way inverted the lens on climate finance and tried to use risk as a means to reprice assets. This turn to risk developed a number of really valuable institutions and frameworks around better understanding of the ways in which climate affects capital markets and affects corporate balance sheets and affects states and sovereigns. But at the end of the day, this turn to risk also ran into limitations. The risk models coming out of the climate community are top down and macro. The needs of the finance community are strategic and granular, so that there was a misalignment of models in terms of their decision usefulness. There is the issue that risks are ultimately transferred to the state. And so trying to drive action in the private sector through the threat of climate risk became a really kind of whack-a-mole jelly donut exercise, where that risk just continued to be transferred to governments in the form of disaster relief, rising healthcare costs, increasing debt, and unemployment benefits. The biggest issue, perhaps, though, with the turn to risk is an issue of equity, which is to say that by using risk as the primary lens and only lens to make decision making, you end up in a very unfortunate situation of a climate redlining of sorts, where there are just areas that are too risky from a climate perspective to invest in, and that's not an acceptable outcome. And so drivers of climate action tried to steer out of this ditch into a better path, and that was this turn to net zero, which kind of combines the desirable elements of the first two turns and skirts around their principal difficulties. And that is a brief description to help contextualize, to understand how we got here. I like to use this timeline because I think it well depicts these turns, which we described. So you first see in 2007, this, I don't know how many of you remember this, but Google made this RE less than C announcement, which seemed like a moonshot at the time, right? The idea that renewables would be less than coal-fired generation was a moonshot in 2007. This is this green finance turn. This is this idea, we're just going to make it cheaper. Then you start to see this turn to risk emerge with the SEC issuing guidance on corporate disclosure related to climate change. The Risky Business Project emerge, a bipartisan effort to understand the economic risks of climate change in the US. You get Paris. Then you have this bombshell, which I think people don't fully appreciate the impact of this IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees C. This is where you start to hear net zero in conversations. No one was talking about net zero as a goal prior to this report. And it really drove home the need for science-based action. And so within a remarkably short period of time, you start to see this net zero ascendancy of suddenly CalPERS, one of the biggest pension funds in the US, make a net zero target for its $500 billion at the time assets under management. Microsoft makes a net negative pledge in 2020. Larry Fink writes one of many letters, that one in particular focused on the need for climate action to manage risks and investment portfolio. Then you end up GFANZ with now 150 trillion. You've got, as of 2022, 91% of the global economy under some sort of net zero pledge. This is truly remarkable. And many understandably celebrate this as a success. We're done, we did it. Look at all these net zero pledges. What I'm gonna share with you though in the minutes that follow is a more sober look at what this all means, and how to capitalize on this momentum to ratchet our toolkit into more effective tools and pathways to get to where we have now pledged we want to go. And so the book in its, the meat of the book is this investigation of the practice of net zero and the ways in which it's going to struggle to add up. And our findings, our conclusions are that there are 4 what we call unsettled accounts that are going to continue to plague this net zero action story until we settle them. And those accounts are data, boundaries, timing, and obligation. So let me walk you through what those are. Data is this issue that there's a lot of noise in the data and there's a lot of greenwashing. This is embodied in these headlines. Each of the accounts are embodied in a headline here. And this is the one, is Exxon more ESG friendly than Tesla, according to some data providers, that you'll get that finding. We've got to get better data that's decision useful. And I hope by the end of this session convince you that we're not there yet, despite, some perceived victories either in California or SEC. We've still got some course corrections to make. Boundaries, best embodied in the confounding questions around the implementation of Scope 3 measurement, is this issue that the boundaries in current practice are confusing. They're, again, highly gameable, and it is fairly easy to move assets, polluting assets, outside the bounds of disclosure or of advocacy. So here's the headline of BP selling a oil field interest to a private equity group that sort of looks like emissions disappeared from the atmosphere, although they just moved from one balance sheet under a spotlight to another that can be hidden. Timing is best embodied in the questions around offsets, and in particular nature-based offsets, here embodied in this headline about California's forest carbon offset buffer pool going up in flames. The issue here is that net zero is essentially a flow concept, and climate is a stock problem. Emissions don't go away in the subsequent year. Emissions persist, depending on the gas, for 1,000 years or more. So we need to attend to the fact that we have stocks and flows in the climate conversation, and we need to account for both. And finally, perhaps the most confounding unsettled account is this issue of what we call obligations. This is the idea that even if you fix data, boundaries, and timing, what are you supposed to do with this information? We have moral obligations and we have scientific obligations, but there isn't a fiduciary imperative that is particularly clear yet for private actors. So now you start to see, some of these banks and the insurance network, leaving the GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, because when rubber meets road, it is difficult, if not impossible, for executives to make the decisions they need to make in pursuit of long-term climate interests while under pressure for short-term fiduciary demands. So that's kind of the state of play and how we got here. Now let's look around. What are we doing? What tools do we have to address these issues and to try and implement net zero? This is my celebration of the GHC Protocol slide before I tell you the ways in which we need to evolve it. The GHC Protocol has been the foundation of the climate action story for decades. When I was at TerraPass, we waited with bated breath for WRI through the protocol to issue new emissions factors, to provide guidance on how to do carbon footprints for companies. And forgive me, you should be able to zap me when I use an acronym that I don't define. GHG, Greenhouse Gas Protocol, WRI, World Resources Institute. This just shows, and let me say, 20 years ago when the protocol was released, when WRI and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development released the protocol, they were the only game in town. The only people who were really deeply considering the implications of climate on business were scientists and advocates. This was developed as a risk management tool, as a proxy to get a sense for the implications of global carbon tax, which at that point was still on the table and still anticipated. It was never built to be an accounting tool. It was never built to compare companies against one another. And it has, because it was sort of the only game in town, and because it was really effective as an advocacy tool and as a internal decision-making tool, it has become the standard and the foundation on which all of climate action has been built. So it is in use for basically all of greenhouse gas reporting. It is embedded in tools like SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative, in all of the transition finance initiatives, and in increasingly in the disclosure regulations that are promulgated now around the world. But there's a problem, which is that it is being used in ways it was never intended. I have looked at this picture of the protocol for decades. I never, until recently, stopped to consider the fact that it's misleading, if not wrong, right? Scope 1 emissions are emissions. They enter the atmosphere. This picture of Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions entering the atmosphere is actually not accurate. Those emissions, those are other people's Scope 1 emissions reassigned and aren't additional emissions in the atmosphere. And so you have this issue of it's not double counting, because if it were just double counting, we'd divide by 2 and be done. It's an indeterminate recursive amount of counting of emissions, which was a feature for the first few decades of the protocol because it was made for better advocacy. And it, again, is this internal decision-making tool for risk management, helped give, a sense for hot spots and where carbon pricing might impact businesses. You also have this issue of data, which again, a feature for the protocol was, don't worry about actual estimates, or actual data, that's too hard and expensive. It's okay. Just use, industry averages or input-output economic analysis where you're just getting a sort of best guess. Again, fine for the last 20 years, problematic as we try and use this tool for capital allocation decision-making. And then you have this issue of boundaries. Again, flexible was a feature because you, again, for internal decision-making and management, you could see how changes in strategy would affect upstream and downstream inventories. But the flexible boundaries are becoming a challenge for those who are trying to implement net zero in earnest. So what I want to impress upon you is not that the protocol has not been valuable. It absolutely has been. But as we transition from voluntary to compliance, and as we scale investment from billions to trillions, we need underlying accounting systems that resolve these issues of data, boundaries, timing, and obligations. We need a stronger foundation. The good news is we have one. It's one thing, the book was essentially a giant diagnostic of all the ways in which net zero is going to struggle to add up. It's helpful, but not that much fun to talk about. And as an entrepreneur and practitioner, there was nothing I hated more than academics shouting from the sidelines, hey, you're doing it wrong, that's not going to work. And, what's better? Until there's something better, I got to do what I got to do. The good news is we've been developing better tools and frameworks, and that's what I'm excited to share with you today. Again, there are 2 ideas here. The first idea is better carbon accounting. And again, as I was saying before, you have these different purposes for accounting methods. You've got sort of an internal need around exemplified by managerial accounting, where you're using it for internal decision-making, forecasting. These are essentially pro forma tools. They're flexible. They're not able to be subject to audit and oversight. That's what I would describe the GHC protocol, to the extent you can even call it an accounting tool, because again, it was never intended for that purpose. But as we move into more robust forces on these tools, we need something that is capable of withstanding that in an external fashion, that can be used, in a financial accounting standpoint, that can be used for investor decision making. It reflects actual past performance. It's rigid and regulated, has firm boundaries, and can be audited. So this is where I'm excited about an idea that was born actually out of 2 faculty, one at Harvard, Bob Kaplan, one at Oxford, Karthik Ramana, that uses the theory of activity-based accounting, which those of you in your MBA programs have probably already encountered. It's think of it as cost accounting and then allocating based on activities, where emissions are calculated and handed off down a supply chain. This is a very overly simplified depiction of what that might look like, where you have here like extraction of some sort of ore material, where that extraction process emits CO2. You capture that and hand it down with an invoice. Here's your cost of goods sold, and here are your emissions liabilities for these materials. Then there's a manufacturing process where additional emissions are generated through the burning of fuels to process these materials, and then you've got a handoff down to an assembly line, say. Now, keep in mind, and because this can be triggering, a firm, any one of these firms, if they had a net zero pledge, they wouldn't hand down any emissions to their customers. They would say, we're net zero, we assume the liabilities of our emissions. I'll come back to that because that's the second idea. I just want to flag it here in case you're looking at this and thinking, wait a minute, we're just passing emissions down the line. This is an example. We've developed a case study with a tire manufacturer to look at what an e-liability ledger would actually look like. This is a picture of it. I can show the case study when it's ready to be shared in the next probably month. But this just shows you, it gives you a sense now managers can see on their e-liability ledger where their hotspots are, where the different raw materials rank in terms of their emissions, and how different processes and activities score in terms of emissions, to then get better visibility on how to improve efficiency and reduce these liabilities. So at the end of the day, the carbon accounting, we need to move from counting carbon, which is what the protocol does, to accounting for carbon. And accounting just has a simple rule. Those, again, MBAs have seen these words together probably already, this mutually exclusive and comprehensively exhaustive, or MICE, approach, which is to say that we count everything and only once. And a MICE accounting system solves the counting issue. It solves the data issue in that primary data is prioritized. You now have incentives for primary data. There's also a way to through an implementation pathway to phase in the use of primary data, so that in a period of, say, 3 years from the starting point, that if you aren't producing primary data by that time, you're charged with the 95th percentile of emissions for that material. And then for boundaries, you've now got these consistent boundaries that can lead to consistent reporting and can be enforced and audited. Lest you think this is just an academic exercise, there is now something called the E-Liability Institute. It was founded by Bob and Karthik. I now serve on the advisory board. My colleague, Mark Roston, who's been a lead author on the work that I'm going to share with you here, is a fellow there. The Institute is piloting e-liability accounting with major companies, lots of industrial materials companies, where just the act of better accounting is informing supply chain decisions. So, for example, the Hitachi pilot was an investigation of the question of whether to use recycled or virgin copper in their transformers. And by doing e-liability accounting, they were able to determine that actually it depends. And in some cases, virgin copper, when they were looking at mines up in Norway and Sweden, those had an emissions profile much lower than recycled copper because of the energy intensity of the recycling process. It depended on the mine, but then you had the information you need to, actually reduce emissions in your supply chain. But that's just half the story, right? You do get these hotspot visibilities with the ledger. You can move things around within your supply chain, but at the end of the day, accounting isn't going to carry us far enough. We need an obligation, right? So Stanford is known for its technology breakthroughs, right? And I would posit here a breakthrough from Stanford that is in the social sciences. And so if I put a box in front of you and I said, hey, look, like here's a big innovation from Stanford. Here's what it does. It scales investment in decarbonization from billions to trillions. It creates massive demand for carbon removals, both nature and technology based, overnight, and clear price signals for those markets to develop. It fixes all the questions that have plagued the carbon markets for the last 30 years, and I'm quite familiar with those from my days at TerraPass. It addresses transition finance and transition pathways and climate targets in a way that we move from this sort of Soviet-style central planning exercise into a rational capital allocation decision-making that can be informed by price signals to accelerate companies' path towards a decarbonization transition. It would align align corporate, national, and global climate ledgers. And so in doing all these things, it essentially makes net zero add up. You'd be like, great, what's the technology? What's the widget? I want to see it. Well, the technology is this emissions liability management. Now, for all you MBAs, I'll just go and say, the marketing department has not worked on this yet. Obviously, this name needs a little work. And actually, the language we've been using recently that I quite like is carbon solvency. We need firms to be carbon solvent and countries to be carbon solvent. What does that mean? It's essentially taking this ledger concept of the liabilities and making it a carbon balance sheet. So you have you do asset liability matching. You have a corresponding E-asset to balance your E-liability. And so this creates a very simple rule that for firms to emit a ton of carbon, they need to generate more in profit than it would cost to permanently remove that ton of carbon. Let me further depict it in terms of this balance sheet idea. So you have your carbon liabilities, your emissions liabilities. This would be for all greenhouse gases. Retain stocks and incremental flows of carbon. Again, this is the timing issue, right? And you need to match those liabilities or balance those liabilities with duration matched assets. Those assets are new removals that balance those liabilities. Now, again, to my previous comment about the simple rule of the cost of emissions, you can think of in a perfect world, back to science, you would say, carbon once entered the atmosphere persists for, call it 1,000 years. The only way to permanently remove that liability would be sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it in the rock for 1,000 years. That's expensive, right? Call it maybe $500 a ton today. What that does is create clear price signals so that a firm has incentive to invest $499 a ton decarbonizing its supply chain to avoid that liability. So you now have avoided emissions as opposed to trading hypothetical counterfactuals in a carbon market. You are capitalizing those avoided emissions on a balance sheet in the form of a lower liability. Now, you are thinking 1,000 years, sure, whatever, she's out of her mind, no one's going to do that. Fair enough. But you can imagine a world, if you squint and put on rose-colored glasses and are very generous, you could say that we're operating in a world of 1 year carbon solvency, where the leading firms have done their inventories. They're wrong, but that's okay. We can improve. And they've got their portfolio of investments to balance those inventories for a year. So somewhere between 1 year and 1,000 years is an opportunity for leadership and an opportunity to implement this carbon solvency in a way that where costs are managed. So you could see a firm pledging net zero, and instead of what that is today, which I don't know, maybe you can tell me what that means today, could mean that as a firm now, we are carbon solvent for the next 50 years, which means our emissions liabilities are balanced with corresponding assets for the next 50 years. And that creates, again, a price signal. If you're at a 50-year duration, it's going to be a lot less than $500 a ton. Maybe it's $20 a ton. And you've got now you've got your price signal for decarbonizing your supply chain and for your pool of e-assets, which could be a mix of nature and technology. So together, these two ideas solve these unsettled accounts. E-liabilities solves the data and boundaries issue, and emissions liability management comes through on timing and obligations. It now creates this obligation through the imperative of solvency, as in balancing your liability, matching your liabilities and your assets. Now you have this obligation and the price signal for capital allocation decision making. Again, just to hammer it home, we're talking about the foundation of all of climate action. Right now, the foundation of all climate action isn't built to withstand the forces that are coming at it. That's why we're seeing struggles in the carbon markets. It's why we're seeing people dropping out, firms dropping out of GFANs. It's why you're seeing sort of a freezing up a little bit of corporate net zero pledge implementation. It's why you're not seeing yet the full unleashing of investment decarbonization, why hard to abate sectors and industrial decarbonization is still going to struggle under the weight of green premiums. With a foundation of carbon accounting and carbon solvency, you resolve the data boundaries, timing, and obligations accounts, and you're able to scale investment in decarbonization. You're able to build healthy and robust carbon markets, and you're able to align carbon ledgers to make net zero add up. Let me say a comment on carbon markets. Again, having been at this in 20 years ago, these questions of permanence, additionality, and leakage have plagued the market forever. Under a carbon solvency framework with good carbon accounting, those issues just go away. Permanence is not the goal, it's duration matching. So buy your afforestation projects, capture the value of growth in existing forests, but when they burn or when they're diseased, you have an impaired asset that needs to be replaced. You have new Scope 1 emissions, and you have to manage these as assets on a balance sheet. In terms of additionality, the question is just simply, is this a new removal? There's your additionality. And then in terms of leakage, the leakage becomes an increased liability on someone else's balance sheet. So while that could start to feel a little more academic, where it would say, well, it only works if everyone does it, at least it's a framework for describing and capturing the questions and the issues that have plagued the carbon market through its current frameworks. So you're wondering, is this real? Like, could this really happen? Yes, and I believe it can. And this is where I'll say, you may have noted in my bio, in some ways I've been kind of a futurist. I was doing web advertising in the mid-90s before anyone knew what that was. I was doing carbon offsets in the early 2000s before anyone knew what that was. Then this kind of climate risk and disclosure work 10, 15 years ago, before people were really having that conversation. And now I will say, this move from the protocol scopes to an E-Liability accounting system will happen. That I'm very confident about. It's just a question of how quickly and how bumpy the ride is going to be. There's still room for the protocol. It can be useful in internal decision-making and advocacy. And we need to understand the difference between disclosure and accounting and move towards better accounting. One of the big opportunities I see on the near-term horizon to shake this opportunity loose is our carbon border adjustments. You see the EU implementing the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which can't be implemented through scopes. It doesn't work. You need an accounting method that can measure embodied carbon in goods. And so that's one avenue for rapid implementation. You're also seeing, again, through the E-Liability Institute, the pilots that we're doing. I think you're going to see firms start to implement these ledgers because they're actually easier than doing GHC Protocol emissions inventories, because it looks a lot more like the activities they do today. They can use their ERP systems to track emissions almost like another currency. You see SAP and EY and other technology providers developing this green token feature to be able to track emissions through complex supply chains. That's already happening. The bigger question, frankly, in my mind, is the carbon solvency one, because that's where we need guts. That's where we make net zero real. That's where you recognize that, oh, this is going to cost money. This is gonna hurt in a sense. It's going to help a whole lot, and there are going to be a lot of winners who suddenly have the price signals they need for their technologies to become to be adopted as you erase these green premiums with clear price signals of the value of that e-asset. And to that, I mean, our group always jokes, people are willing to do anything for climate as long as it doesn't work. We've been at this a long time, doing things that were sort of the best available, and wrapped in sort of hope and aspiration that is entirely understandable and necessary, but that at the end of the day, again, when rubber meets road, isn't going to get us there. This is a framework that can get us there, and you can imagine borrowing the playbook that's already been written, where asset owners drove the success of this, again, net zero and this disclosure. We're saying you moved from conversation in the wake of the IPCC 1.5 degree C report to the TCFD implementation, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, bringing together the private leaders in the private sector to develop a robust framework to then be used in a voluntary setting, in pushing forward the coalescence of various standards into the International Sustainability Standards Board standards. You then see California and the SEC kind of moving in step. If you turn the prism a little bit and try the next iteration of that, you can imagine the same playbook running, but instead of disclosure, it's accounting. Show me your carbon balance sheet. We only invest in companies that are carbon solvent for the next 50 years. You know, Apple made an announcement of their climate carbon neutral watch. I don't know what that is, but you can imagine a day where Apple sells you the phone and says your phone is net zero, is carbon solvent for the next 50 years. We have calculated all the embodied emissions in this device. We are managing a pool of removal assets to balance those liabilities for the next 50 years. Companies may even take a step further and say, we are going to consider the downstream implications, the cradle, instead of just cradle to gate, we're going to go cradle to grave with this. We're going to make assumptions about your use, where you're charging, how much you're charging, and we're going to voluntarily manage a portfolio of liabilities on behalf of our customers. That, of course, can't be audited because it's always going to be an estimate. It's always going to be out of their control, but it still leaves the door open for that additional leadership if people want to go cradle to gate. I'm sure you all have lots of questions. I'm going to just show you this slide real quick, which is to say, I'm really excited about these ideas. It is the first framework I've seen in the 3 decades I've been working on climate that makes everything add up. And there's a lot more work to do, right? We have a lot of questions, particularly around measurement, reporting, verification, particularly in nature, how you get these measurements, the science of measurement, the technology of measurement. There's really interesting legal questions around the trusts that might be used to manage these pool of assets. You can think about them as analogous to pension benefits, to pension trusts. We have all kinds of additional areas of research. We, of course, invite all of you and anyone who's interested and compelled by these ideas to continue to contribute to their evolution. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And coming from the corporate sustainability world myself, I was feeling a lot of the application and thinking through how that would have affected me in my previous roles. And it's just, I'm so excited to see where this all goes in the coming years. Please hop in and ask any questions that you have in the Q&A function. We've got a few queued up here already that I'll start with, but anyone listening, feel free to add some more. So the first is a concept of carbon balance sheets or emission liability management is very interesting and seems logical. What policy action or industry action would help advance the conversation towards the adoption of the practice?
Yeah, love that question. So, I mean, first, the good news is this can be, anything matters. So it can be voluntary, it can start on a voluntary footing. And that just, again, that's the TCFD, ISSB, 2SEC playbook, where you just start doing it. We're just asset owners, because they own this risk and they have limited ability to affect it, start to demand carbon balance sheets and carbon solvency to a certain duration from their holdings. In terms of regulation, I mean, one of the things I'm trying to do right now is just get my foot in the door and make sure that we don't close the door on accounting. Because you see California is a perfect example. And as you noted, I was co-chair of the advisory group that looked at investment portfolios and the state's budget in consideration of climate risk management. And, I worry SB 253, which is the emissions disclosure law, is kind of a careful what you wish for situation, where we're going to get this mass confessional of emissions inventories that are a boondoggle for carbon software accounting companies and accountants and lawyers, and consultants, but like unclear what that does for actual emissions in the real economy. But if that were an accounting rule instead of a disclosure rule, that would be huge. And CARB, there's still daylight there, so I'm trying to keep that daylight open and say, hey, CARB, like let's work through the implementation of this so that we're doing accounting. Well, the SEC, I think the SEC is going to walk this back. I don't think Scope 3 will be there. But again, like keeping regulation open for accounting. But as we develop the practice on a voluntary arena, you could then see again this playbook emerging of then you require accounting as opposed to disclosure. And you can also see in the same way the voluntary movement pushed asset owners to demand this information. Governments like California and the federal government now have procurement laws around emissions factors. They have and disclosures. And so you can see the government saying, we only do business with, we only procure from companies that are, furnish a carbon balance sheet and are carbon solvent for 50 years. So there's a path from voluntary to compliance, but at the end of the day, the regulatory framework here is really boring. It's FASB and GAAP and accounting rules. And then it's at some point countries, this also, by the way, I've been talking a lot about the corporate sector, which is, I think, the first phase of implementation to capitalize on the momentum of the net zero pledgeorama. And you can imagine corporates, particularly in the global north, there is no more carbon budget. So carbon solvency doesn't, there isn't a carbon budget. But when you move to countries, and particularly in developing countries, then you start to allocate a carbon budget in the implementation of carbon solvency. But this is a tool for countries to manage their assets and liabilities. It starts to create a framework for the protection of nature because that's an asset on your balance sheet. So there's more to be done on the regulatory front, but the initial phase is voluntary to boring accounting standards to mandates.
Thank you. We had a question that came in around asking if you could talk a little bit about the difference between E-Liabilities approach and EPNL. The environmental profits and loss. Yeah, so the difference with E-Liability accounting is it's real time and dynamic and variable to different conditions. So a lot of existing sort of environmental impact product life cycle assessments are done sort of once and then static. This is a similar, but in application to activities and allocation of emissions across multiple activities. So it's not just the product itself; it's the allocation of those emissions across the firm's activities, which includes its overhead and includes its management. And so you're tracking emissions through a supply chain, allocating them based on activities, which is a different approach than just a product-based assessment. Thank you. So there's a lot of questions around how to make this credible. And so, you pointed out the challenges of data, boundaries, timing, obligations, but most fundamentally is that the net zero pledges by companies aren't really binding or enforceable. So how realistic is it in the end to use this as a tool for meeting that 1.5 degrees target? Well, look, the way I think about this is we have two options, two doors we can walk through. We can walk through the one where we pretend that these net zero pledges are real and someday, somehow, magically, something's going to change, even though there's no obligation. And the tools to get there are very challenging in their implementation. Or we can go through the door where it's real and specific and you know where you are and where you're going. And I certainly don't expect companies to tomorrow announce, carbon solvency for 1,000 years. It's very expensive. It's not real, that's not going to happen. But at least they can know where they are and where they're going. And I'd like to imagine, and I've had many conversations with folks who are responsible for the implementation of these pledges within large companies who genuinely want to do it. There was real earnest intention behind many of these pledges, but they don't have the tools they need to get there. So I'd like to appeal to the better corners of humanity and imagine the world where that's a serious pursuit. Let's not forget too that that's in every company and every investor's best interest. It's just a collective action problem, and we don't have the tools we need to make sure everyone's moving in the right direction in a measurable, auditable way. And so this is a framework that enables this whole net zero conversation to be real. But we have to do it. Yeah, totally agree. There's some questions around the transition to this kind of opportunity as well. So the transition period to E-Liabilities may still have some challenges around data quality and accessibility. So what are the opportunities you see to help kind of navigate that transition?
Yeah, that question comes up a lot, and it's a good one. I mean, look, data is a problem in any scenario. It's a problem now. It's a problem. There's still challenges for E-Liabilities in terms of data. The way I think about that question is that, or a couple things. One is that you can imagine an implementation of E-Liabilities where you have a 3-year runway. You do the best you can in the development of that primary data, and then the clock goes off, and if you're not in a primary data universe or place by the end of that 3-year period, you're at the highest emission. You're 95th percentile of your industry, which creates strong incentive to get that actual data. I would also say, using actual data was too expensive 20 years ago. Of course, the protocol didn't have actual data; that was impossible. But we're getting better, and we're getting closer, and we've developed, for example. And kudos to the advocacy community that's catalyzed this. But we've talked to a big CPG company that's interested in implementing E-Liabilities because they have been able to build that first mile supply chain data infrastructure to track from the forest to that first mill because of their work on avoided deforestation. So there's just so much more technology and capacity to track this data. We need more, but right now in the current system, there isn't an incentive to invest in those improvements. There's knowing that we need to, which is one thing, but actually having the incentive. And so now with an accounting system that's audited, that has that has primacy for primary data, there's then incentive to get that right. Otherwise, you get a lot of free riding where one actor makes one changes the industry standard, and boom, everybody has a lower emissions profile. Like, that just doesn't cut the mustard.
So you mentioned some companies you're already working with, but if we've got any of the listeners who are looking to engage more deeply in this conversation, do you have any recommendations of some of the good actors that you can mention? Any companies or organizations that are leading the way, and or are there any places you recommend students to go to learn more about this more broadly?
Yeah, so there were the names I flashed up on that E-Liability Institute slide. I would encourage you to go to the E-Liability Institute webpage, which, if anyone's looking for a project and wants to improve that page, that's needed. But there are a number of firms mentioned there. There are case studies that are published. We at Stanford, are working with some large tech companies in implementing E-Liability pilots in the electricity sector, data center energy use questions, and its application to scope 2, which has become fascinating, and we're learning a lot with that. So there's engagement with our research team at Stanford, but the Institute is stood up for the purpose of piloting E-Liabilities. We have also, as I mentioned, done this case study with a tire company where we're actually investigating not just the E-Liability inventory assessment, but ELM, the carbon solvency. What would it cost? What would be the EBITDA hit to this firm if they were, 1,000-year duration compliant versus 50 versus 20, and it starts to become reasonable at 20 years of duration, and so that's been an interesting learning. So I would just also point you to the Stanford Sustainable Finance Initiative website. On our homepage, if you scroll down one tick, there's a carbon accounting and emissions liability management section. You click on that, and there's a whole library of work that all of the papers we've produced, podcasts, videos. I would encourage you. I'm not trying to sell the book by any means. If you are but it's linked there too. And if all of you who are current students should be able to access it for free through your university library. It's a Palgrave publication, so you should be able to download it for free.
Great, thank you so much. And I will follow up with this session to an email out to everyone who signed up with a link to some of those resources that Alicia just mentioned for reference as well. I'm going to ask one last question, and then we'll wrap it up. What I've appreciated so much about this conversation is how tactical it's been and how specific you've been, but I'm going to take you all the way up to the highest level on this one. We like to ask the question around advice. MBAs are always asking for advice and what they're doing, a lot of career changers. So I'm curious, what's one piece of advice that you have for our MBA audience who are looking to kind of make their careers and make their mark within this climate space?
One piece is tricky, but I will limit it to one. If it's just one, I mean, what you're doing essentially in learning. I mean, I see, I've been at this a long time, and it's been lonely for a long time, and now there's a huge wave of influx of people, which is fantastic. But I feel like from my seat, a lot of people are running into a burning building without sort of knowing where the valuable things are to grab. And so take the time to understand the challenge, its history, what has been tried, what didn't work then, but what might work now because contents have shifted during flight. What are the systems? People sort of think about projects and technologies and like easy fixes. There are no easy fixes to this problem, although I would say accounting is the foundation on which we can build the next chapter. But understand, embrace the complexity, understand how systems are at play here, and then think before you think fast and slow is my takeaway.
Well, thank you so much for that. And Alicia, thank you so much for being with us here today. I just wanted to wrap with our gratitude. I think this was a really fantastic session and hopefully gave a lot of really actionable things for our students to look at as they're going through their MBA journeys. For those of you who joined a little bit late, I wanted to just do a quick summary to remind you to check out climatecap.org to learn more about ClimateCAP. You'll find out more about our future MBA Academy sessions. You can follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and our YouTube channel, where we will be posting a recording of this session today. And again, just to highlight a few other ways you can get engaged if you are interested in joining us at the MBA Summit. Those ticket sales go on sale October 26th at 8 p.m. Eastern. And the MBA Fellowship application deadline is 11/1. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you again, Alicia. We really appreciate you having you here.
Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks. Bye-bye.